she's, sitting down with her husband and it's not, and it ends up being somebody else, and they conceive a child and it's Arthur, and, Merlin, very famous story, kind of helps everything happen. But in the story, it says he also has a sister from the same two parents named Anna. And now Arthur has all kinds of very famous sisters. People have written many books about them. But this sister disappeared. For all that I could tell, she was absorbed into the myths of everybody else. And I thought, how strange that someone from the same, same marriage of these two people would just disappear completely. And that's really where I started asking the questions. I actually tweeted today that so many of my stories come from this idea of why not? Why not? And what would happen to her? What if she didn't disappear? What if there's a better story for it? And I liked this idea of basically creating her own prophecy, because prophecies are so important in Arthur, but that she would be forgotten. So I could pretty much do whatever I wanted and have her live this existence outside of the regular narrative and blend in so much of my own learning. And that's really where the inspiration came from. It was a way for me to try to put my own fingerprint on a very overwhelming, very amazing genre within fantasy literature that I've always loved, but really take it from a very feminist point of view, someone who is stuck. There's no way she's going to ever escape the politics and the machinations of court. She's Arthur's sister, so she is prized chattel at best, right? She's literally going to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. But I also wanted to show a kind of agency that she could have within that, so that there's still a story to be had that has action and adventure, but it's not the same kind of action adventure that you hear, with the Knights of the Round Table and the Holy Grail. So that's how it came to be. And I wrote the draft of it about 10 years ago. I sat on it for years. Every year I'd come back to it and write some more in it and edit it and change some things around. And then I had someone approach me and say, hey, do you have any books lying around? And I said, well, I have this Arthurian tale that, got rejected once, and then I got embarrassed and just threw it at the bottom of my computer. And I love this story and I believe in it, and it just needs the right editor and the right publishing house. And that's how it came to be. And they loved it, and we worked on it, and now it's here.
And here we are.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting way you put the thing, that, why not? Like you said in your tweet. And that comes to my next question, which is basically what's your favorite genre of writing?
I love fantasy. I just do. I love fantasy that is unpredictable. I read a lot of YA fantasy because I feel like YA fantasy actually has a lot more diversity and feminism and just thoughts about people of different backgrounds and sexualities and genders. It's starting to reach mainstream fantasy, but I'm not big. I mean, Tolkien was the first thing I read that just made me want to write. I just love this idea of creating a world that's similar to ours, but has, so many underlying incredible stories. So I read The Lord of the Rings probably 3 times over. I loved The Chronicles of Narnia, but there were always things about those stories. A, I felt left out as a woman. B, I felt that it was like the whitest thing ever in the universe. And how do you travel all these places? And either races are weird mirrors of exactly how they are in our world, with the same prejudices and discomfort, or they just don't exist, right? Like everyone has blonde hair and blue eyes, and everyone has the same kind of almost quasi-religions. And so I'm lucky that, I've been writing fantasy most of my life, but I feel like we're in a really strong age where we're seeing more and more writers really coming to publication with really fantastic stories that shake things up. N.K. Jemisin is one of my absolute favorite authors, and her Broken Earth trilogy I shove it at everybody I know, because that's the kind of stories that I hope to write someday. That, obviously I cannot as a white woman have obviously that same kind of thing, but this idea of truly making you think about things. The example I use is that, even though I read a lot of literature by people of color, I never considered hair texture. And if you read the Broken Earth trilogy, it's a big deal. It's a big deal because in Black culture, hair texture is a big deal. And I just have wavy hair. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but it is such a thing. And with world building, these other perspectives are so important. So I tend to gravitate toward that a lot, and just really trying to open up my own mind. Also, things like ability and disability are very important to me as well. A wonderful, wonderful series that's YA is by Fran Wilde, the Updraft series. And you don't quite realize that it's about disability right away, but then you realize that it is as you go through it. And I won't spoil why that is, but if you want to explore something that really talks about that, I think that's an incredible thing, as well as people that are neurodivergent, and, building characters that aren't all, without crippling anxiety or depression and things like that, making sure that characters represent actual human beings. And fantasy can be such a wonderful place to explore that, because there are monsters and there is magic, and then trying to figure out where those things overlap and how that impacts humanity is really fascinating to me.
We have some really similar tastes when it comes to reading.
Good.
Just the same kind of authors, and that's what I want to talk about next, basically, and that's world building. Sure. So how do you do your world building? Because there's so much in world building, right? You have to look at everything. You have to look at geography, culture, trade, economics. So where do you pick up your elements from?
Well, I think that's, it really depends. I do write a lot of historical fiction, and historical fiction, it's got its benefits and its drawbacks for sure. But I think the interesting thing is about how I learned about you all is that I firmly believe that fabric is one of the best ways to do world building. Fabric is going to tell you almost everything you need to know about a culture, from their agriculture, their trade, their status, their races, because you're going to have to ask who picks the cotton, right? Or who's harvesting the flax, who's gathering the silkworms, who grows them, who benefits from them, who's selling it, how far does it have to go? All of these questions. What's the climate like that you're growing it in? So all of these questions are a really fun way to build your world. And our world has such an incredible history with fashion and with materials. I don't have to tell you, if you're familiar at all with with Asia and India, and how huge of an impact it had, how colonialism impacted it, how there was just atrocities done, but there were also incredible things that were done from an artist perspective. I mean, I sometimes assume that people just know this stuff, but clearly I've had more response over I call them my thread talks, than just about anything I've done, because this is something so common to us. The last 100 years have dulled us to the concept of how important clothing is. And, you didn't own 70 shirts 100 years ago, even with the beginnings of mass production. And you often remade a dress over and over again. But if you were really rich, you could wear a different dress for every event that you had. And the scaling, how much money that cost, there almost isn't a comparison, because it was so expensive before to own and produce clothing that $500 then is so much more now. It still sounds kind of like a lot of money, like a $500 dress, but a Regency gown for that much, we're talking about, it could be close to $30,000 for a wedding gown now, which occasionally you hear people doing that, but that's usually but that's just a regular, it's a very nice gown. So I love
much. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that aspect of world building. I love food. World building through food is very similar, in terms of access and agriculture. You really kind of have to think in a lot of ways about how a culture builds. We know that, pastoral cultures have very different tendencies in terms of how women are treated or how religion grows, versus migratory societies have very different understandings, and how that relationship is to the earth and to animals. And so I like to kind of start with what I know of the world, and then start asking those questions, the what ifs, the why nots, and build on that. What would it look like if there was real magic that we could see and feel, so people didn't have to go hungry? What if you lived in a world where women just could decide they didn't want to get pregnant, like some animals are able to do, right? It wasn't a concern, or that there was a magic drink you could take or a ritual that you could do. And that starts to spin off all these things. Now, that all comes with a caveat, especially in historical fiction, because I'm a major nerd. I'm probably the number one visitor to the Metropolitan Museum of Art website because I love it so much. But I have to be careful not to get what I call lost in the China patterns, because I love accurate historical detail. But if I've been spending 3 hours trying to decide what pattern should go on the teacups in this scene, I'm probably not really paying attention to the characters, because as much world building as you can do, you don't want to lose that really important part, which is the emotional connection that your readers have. Because no matter how, exotic or strange the world, we're still reading those stories in this world that we're in right now. This is still we're going to bring our own backgrounds and our prejudices and our thoughts and our emotions to it. So you just have to make sure that you're not navel gazing too much. But I try to give myself some freedom, especially right now in this time of the world, because I find so much comfort in research. I will always be a researcher, and yeah, keeping a lot of links open is really good. And Wikipedia is fantastic, especially if you start there. Many people don't realize how valuable the bibliography is at the bottom of Wikipedia articles. And it's the same thing with many other things. That's a great, springboard. So.
Yeah. Again, another point of similarity, like when we started talking about clothes, right, and making clothes, for the past, since 2018, I guess, I started to learn how to knit. So I have been making my own clothes. In fact, wait, I'll show you this dress I made for a friend.
I'm excited. I can't sew. I knit and I crochet, but I'm miserable. Oh, wow. That is beautiful.
So I put the back.
And, wow.
It's a knit dress, but
That's incredible.
I basically crocheted the button bands, and because I couldn't find out an easier way to, make to knit the button bands. Yes. So I just basically crocheted it.
Yeah, you can combine that. When I discovered crochet, it took me a long time because I started knitting, and my brain was so stuck on knitting that it was so hard for me to change over to crochet. But then I realized that crochet is almost more like clay in some ways. You have this basic things you can do, and you can shape it whatever way you want. That was so freeing for me. I actually have some alpaca wool from a friend of mine's alpacas that I've watched grow up on Facebook, and they sent them to me, and I cannot wait to make something out of it. So I feel you.
Wow. One of the ways I got over the whole crochet not being natural to my hands was that I knit with my right hand, and I'm a lever knitter. So, I just jam one needle under my hand. And I crochet with my left.
Oh, wow.
That actually helps because, as a knitter, when you're knitting with your right hand, you're moving your left hand and your yarn is in the right thing. So when you crochet with your left, it's the same arrangement. So you're used to having the yarn in one hand and the instrument in one. So that helps.
For me, I basically realized that the thread was like another needle. And when I made that connection with the crochet, is you have the work and you have the crochet, and it's very similar. But yes, I'm with you. It's amazing. I've never made a full dress that is incredibly impressive. So.
Yeah, indeed. And Natania, coming back to your point, you said that your background is something that shows in your work. Yeah. So I know you have ADHD, and I also read that your mother and sister suffered from cancer. How do you think this affected your writing?
Well, I think those things, certainly for me, I started writing quite young, and I read voraciously. My most prized possession was my own little library stack of books. That was just the best, And so it was very natural to me to kind of move into writing. My dad actually is also ill, and he's had a series of rare diseases since I was about 6 years old. So I grew up in a kind of unusual family dynamic where my father really couldn't be the sort of macho baseball playing dad as much, because he would get very, very sick. He was bedridden for quite a few years. He's doing great. He's still around. But I think I learned to, my hyper focus is writing. It's one of them for sure. And I have many interests, very many interests. But for me, the sort of meditative ability to kind of go into my stories is really how I process emotions. And oh, my dog is saying hi. I was like, what is this? This is a dog. She's very cute. But I learned that, you know, art in general became kind of my palette for emotions. I'm not a naturally expressive person necessarily. When I'm feeling a way, I don't tell people around me. I tend to keep it very much in. So art has always been the healthy way for me to get that out, because I didn't want to rock the boat when I was a kid. I didn't want to burden my parents with more than that they dealt with. And my mom's cancer, when my freshman year of college, I had to change my college initially. I did 1 year at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst because she was so sick, and I stayed home with her. I actually had gotten into Ivy League schools and had decided last minute that I was going to stay home and help her. And I don't really remember much of that year, but I did a lot of writing, and really I started writing more seriously as a speculative fiction writer, because I had quite a few years where I was like, I don't want to say that I write fantasy. It's so dorky. And then I just said, I don't care. I am a dork. I'm a complete geek, and I love this stuff, and I'm not ashamed of it. And I also had my son. I have 2 kids. My son who is autistic. So that I didn't know, obviously, initially, but I started writing and really taking myself seriously and kind of committing to writing when I had him, because I had this moment that just said, I don't want him to say, Mommy, what did you want to be when you grew up? And I would say, I want to be a writer, but I don't have anything to show, right? There's nothing I could say. So that really was my impetus. And we've spent the last 15 years working so hard with him that I didn't quite put it together that it was very likely that I had ADHD. It really took until, and I'm almost 40, so it took until about 6 months ago where I really, for me, the strain of quarantine and losing, you know, with ADHD, you love novelty, you love impulse, you love things to look forward to, changes in your day. This is all very exciting for me. And I work a job where I get to travel. I would travel the world. So I used before this year, I was probably in Europe 5 or 6 times a year. It was always something to look forward to. And all of a sudden that stopped, and I was just stuck at home, and I was getting so overwhelmed, so exhausted at the end of the day. I didn't have time to write. I didn't have time for anything. And I got on TikTok because my daughter, who's 8, was like, I wanted to make sure I knew what she was talking about. And I love social media. I've absolutely loved social media. It can be terrible, but it's been the single best part for my career ever. And I started getting all these videos from people talking about women with ADHD. And it was bizarre. This algorithm seemed to quasi-diagnose me and at least give me some new language and things that I had struggled with my whole life that I thought was just my own shortcomings. So what has been really freeing for me is I had to go through those here in the United States, it's difficult on a normal day to get good psychiatric care. Thankfully, I was able to do it, work with my doctor, get on better medicine. I've been trying different medications for anxiety and panic and depression for years. Well, there's a big reason that didn't work because I was treating a symptom and not the cause. So it's been incredibly eye-opening. And like I said, the relief has been great, and it's been wonderful for my writing and for my art. I really had some difficult times. It's difficult to realize that you are fundamentally different. It's one thing to feel that way, but then when you realize like, oh no, this stuff this doesn't go away. I get to treat it and learn my way around it. But once I let go of that, I kind of said, back to what I was saying about my emotions, art is my emotional language and I want to share it. And so I have anyway, but it's kind of given me a little bit more impetus to keep going. And I think it's important to hear, people that are neurodiverse writing neurodiverse stories, to have characters. I think certainly there are some in Queen of None. I don't think I think a lot of them could be diagnosed with a lot of really interesting things, and some of them have probably a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
But the book I'm writing right now, I actually have 2 main characters, and one is autistic and one has ADHD. And that's been really fun to kind of go in knowing ahead and knowing like I know enough people and I have enough of this that I can do this in a way that people will probably not know unless they actually know enough people. Because, as they say, one person with autism means one person with autism. It's not a spectrum. It is it's four dimensions of how people are, and that's an important thing for me to be able to do, especially from an own voices perspective. Now that I am officially there.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I mean, yeah, of course, that is amazing. I would love to read your new book when it comes out.
Sure.
But so my Zoom call is going to end now.
Yes.
In less than a minute. Could I please request you to join
Sure.
back?
We will do.
And this was one, relatable. What you said was really relatable, because there some of these issues are issues that I struggle with as well.
Okay. Thank you for coming back. And yeah, I noticed you spoke about how fabric is, so fundamental to world building. And I did notice that in the story, Anna, the protagonist, she touches a lot of fabric. There's a lot of smells, there's a lot of picturesque nature. Um, it was quite nice. I mean, I could smell the blossoms of the apple tree and, look at when she goes into the forest with Lancelot. It was amazing. So yeah, we had a few more questions about your book, Queen of None, but of course, this is the non-spoiler section, which people can hear about. So personally, I really enjoyed the book a lot. Like I told you, I stayed up a lot of nights. I am a student and, I work on the laptop the entire day, so my eyes really pain at the end of the day. But it was so interesting that I just had to stay up at night and look into my mobile screen till I finished it. Um, and there were some real moments that were very relatable to me. Even though this is set in, the Arthurian age, it was pretty interesting to me. For example, when Nimue, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, when Nimue said that, when she was born, she just wanted to eat a lot of food. She was really hungry. I can relate to that all the time.
And
Natania, I think you're in mute, maybe.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can.
yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not the only relatable part, right? Like, I think what you said in the beginning when you were talking about the book, about having a certain feminist perspective here, and I think we both really related to it, to many aspects of the story and to the characters themselves. And like Ashvini said that, she had to spend a lot of time, like she couldn't keep the book down. I couldn't read the book in its entirety for a very simple reason, that I would read a line and then that line would just hit me deep in my soul, and I would have to just like put the book down and be like, some things never change, or do they?
Well, that's
Most
always beautiful to
definitely.
hear, because you want it to be right, and it's kind of poetic. There's a long poetic history for Arthur, so I want the language to be lush. And that's something people always say when I get reviews, lush writing, and I guess it is. I want it to evoke feeling, and that English, as ridiculous as it is of a language, because it really is, it still gives so much amazing flexibility, so many words. They can all mean the same thing, but they sound different. They look different on a page. I have a lot of opinions about, fonts and typeface and the way things look together. And I wanted to make that a big thing. And the environments are important, because I wanted this to be sort of not really historic. If you read the opening, I talk about how it's kind of out of history. It's like a reflection of it, because there was no Arthur. And everything we know came, if you want to be historic, you're going to miss out on all these other characters. So I said, if I just say, this is the myth, but kind of through a mirror of time, then I could kind of go with it. And I love the pre-Raphaelite artists and their vision of the Arthurian world. And the women are always so statuesque, they're not wimps. They're strong, physically strong, beautiful women. They're muscular, they're round, they're curvy, and they're draped in these incredible dresses. And they're always in the middle of doing something amazing. And those were really a huge inspiration for me. It's like, what is going on in this picture? And how can I try to capture those moments where all the details are there? And it takes, you also know that the reader is going to bring in their own experiences and things as well. And I think for women, we are so often not in the stories, or if we are, we're just like plot points, And I wanted to make that more than plot points, for sure.
Most definitely, yeah. In fact, this specific point of portrayal of women, I really enjoyed the different body types women had in this story. And I recall telling Sanchi that, oh, look, there are so many different characters. And at some point I was rather, I don't know the correct word, I was
flummoxed.
Yeah.
Flummoxed by this portrayal
Thank
of, when a woman is round, like the kind of times we live in, if you have, okay, you're round, it's a bad thing for us, right? Like, how many times have people just told us, lose weight? But in the book, when you are talking about, say, a certain, this is the non-spoiler section.
Yes,
let's not too many spoilers.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, a good example is Guinevere. I wanted Guinevere to be very, very round and earthy. I mean, she is a heavy, voluptuous woman, and she gets pregnant and she gets even more voluptuous, and she is the most beautiful woman Arthur saw her and didn't even really dig chicks, but saw her and was like, she's so beautiful, I have to have her, and I don't think that it's funny because I do it unconsciously now, just because I know a lot of women, and I know women come in all shapes and sizes, and beauty is so much more interesting when it's inclusive, and we have different abilities as on top of that as well. And that's another thing that TikTok is fantastic about, that I've never seen women taking so much control of what is beautiful and it's an amazingly brave thing as well, of putting your body out there, flaws and all, and saying, calling out women who are, normal, not normal, but straight sized women, saying, oh, I have a little tiny belly, and going, no, this is a belly. This is beautiful, and this is fine, and this is how women's bodies are. I've had 2 kids. My body will never go back to whatever it was before. It doesn't mean that it's wrong or flawed. And that was the other thing with Anna. She has stretch marks at one point, if you remember. It's like very cliché,
That's the line that comes out to me, when she's telling Gwen, when she says that what does a quote unquote, what does a comely man like, what will a comely man like him see, what this body that has borne 3 children and has scars to show for it. Mm-hmm. That's one of the times I had to put the book down.
But it's something women since the beginning of time, our bodies change so much, our minds change. I joke when I was pregnant with both of my children, I think I wrote this a little bit into the story, is that I felt like a different person. I was not myself. I didn't write. I didn't play music. I didn't paint. I loved to watch weird TV shows. I was really into bizarre foods when I was pregnant with my daughter, which is like, Andrew Zimmern traveling the world, eating the most bizarre, gross things you could ever imagine in every culture in the universe. I don't find it gross. I find it fascinating. I'm sitting there just like, how many bugs is he eating? Straight from the cow? Blood straight from the cow? Sure. It was just, I love learning about what that stuff is like. And I think when I was pregnant, it was just, I don't know. I found it. And I watched a ton of the Vampire Diaries. I watched the entirety of that entire series. I don't know. I can't explain it.
It's all right. We don't judge here. Your secret is safe with us and with whoever is listening to this YouTube stream. No, but yeah, I definitely found it very relatable, and especially, you know, how people have this idea that, oh, women should have round breasts, big breasts, and a big butt, but they should be stick thin. That is completely unrealistic, you know?
Yeah. And there are some lucky women who have that particular ideal, but as someone who grew up in the 90s with heroin chic, I was like, there's no amount of dieting that will ever make me 97 pounds. Like I would be dead. But that was and it's interesting because in the Middle Ages as well, it was young bodies, especially almost, barely pubescent bodies were considered beautiful. But then there was a time where Rubenesque women, right, in the Baroque period, with cellulite everywhere, was considered, they called it butterfat, was the description. Rolls were beautiful. And that's the thing, beauty is not a singular experience, and there's so many cultural things that pay into that. We just, unfortunately, with mass media and with the beauty industry, it's so much easier to sell things if we tell people that that's the case. For me, someone commented on this, I think 2 days ago, about my eyebrows, and I always laugh because I grew up in the 90s. Eyebrows were not in. Like, eyebrows were, you had pencil thin eyebrow. I waxed the heck out of my forehead. I'm just glad they grew back. And people are always like, what did you do to your eyebrows? I was like, nothing. It's just like, and now it's big deal. And brow bars are all the rage. People penciling in and microblading and everything. And I'm just like, well, when I was in high school, people that said I had caterpillar eyebrows, and why don't you pluck your eyebrows more? And, beauty is fickle. That's why it's more about, you want it to be more about the people. And then if you represent a wide variety of people, you're not defining it as one thing. So.
Indeed, yeah. Beauty, I guess, does lie in the eyes of the beholder. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that was amazing. I mean, I really enjoyed, reading about Pfeiffer and how she was beautiful. And then there was Gwen, and there was Mavra, who had a different, completely different, although they were sisters,
Yeah, and that's actually, so the oldest stories, the Welsh triads, which are potentially even more ancient than when we first have them in the 10th century, they say that Arthur has 3 wives named Guinevere. The 3 wives of, I remember reading that and being like, everything's 3, right? 3 wives of Guinevere. They also say his 3 favorite mistresses, so clearly he had a lot going on. But I thought it would be neat to play on that and have the 3 sisters of Leodegrance. All their names are from the same name. So Guinevere, Maura, and Huifar are all different Welsh derivatives. So that's kind of how I played that one out a little bit.
That was really interesting now that I see that,
Yeah.
These are the kind of things that, just enhance the book reading experience.
Good, I hope so.
and not just beauty and the other things that are related to, gender and gender stereotypes, and especially like when you were talking about Anna's marriage and her personal life, and even that entire section and that entire part of her story was so relatable.
Yeah, I mean, there are different problems when your brother is king of all England.
Apologies, my laptop just crashed. I'm trying to get everything back in order. It should take about 2 minutes. So sorry for that.
The way that we speak, but they wouldn't speak, if you actually had them speak the way that they were talking back then, it would be impossible to read. So one of the things that I tried to do is get rid of a lot of contractions. So it's a lot of cannot and would not and should not. But the cadence of their words has to be more modern, because you'll lose, people won't follow along. They just won't. And one of the people that I love who actually, I read the book after I wrote this, but when I read it, I said, wow, we're very kindred in that way, is Madeline Miller's Circe is like that, where it's written about the Odyssey and the Trojan War and that kind of period, but it's not in this heightened language. It's in a language that people can actually read and digest and understand. And that's, readership is very important. As someone who reads a lot of, historical stuff, it doesn't bother me because I'm used to it. My background's in Middle English, so I can read Chaucer and things like that. But it's important that you are able to make it accessible as well.
So your reason for blending archaic and modern was basically to make it accessible while still giving it the kind of flavor that is required for a work like this?
Exactly.
So, yeah, Ashwini, I was saying that, things that leapt out to me didn't leap out to you, and vice versa. Like you noticed the language thing while I did not. I was just very much, in the flow of things. So,
Yeah.
we
I
noticed
noticed
different
how
things.
I noticed how you were using, you had specifically mentioned it in fact that you were going to use a mix of archaic and modern language, and I did notice it. I was wondering why though.
Well, like I unfortunately, when you were away, we were saying that you want to have the feeling of the place, right? So certain words I think help to build the world, right? So instead of ghost, we might say ghast, which is an older version of the word, and that makes it feel like fantasy without going the direction of like full Tolkien, where everyone speaks like they're in Shakespeare and it's very, very rigid and you don't quite have the emotional resonance. So I also, did fewer contraction words that might not have been as common, and tried to use the sort of that world as descriptors, because you certainly don't want to say like he was as loud as a train, because there's no trains, and even though Tolkien did that very famously in Lord of the Rings, that just even he was like trying to speak to his audience. But I think I found a pretty good mix, and I can write more heightened, and I'm certainly doing that right now. I'm writing a Regency story, so people do speak, but they're very witty in it, and you can't overdo it, because then it feels, a lot of people will immediately be turned off from it and you won't get the readers. So
Yeah, understandable. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. So I would like to move on to the third section of this
Sure.
interview.
Oh, not yet.
Not
I have
yet.
one left. One
one
question
left. Okay.
Yeah.
Basically, I think the really interesting thing that I found in the book was, okay, so for the people who don't know, Ashwini and I are Indians, and Indians have a very specific culture towards a family, and although now most of us live in nuclear families, our families
Right.
included, but there was this time where all of us were, in joint families, and we have this tight-knit community thing going on. So it was very interesting for me to see that, this lady, Anna, she has 4 children. I mean 5, but you get it, right? But like for first son, she sends him to court, to her brother's place. She sends her other 2 children to their uncle, and when she gives birth to her 4th and 5th child, RIP her daughter, but she sends her son to her older sister, who was childless. So very interesting for us to see this mother living without her children. Something that we cannot fathom, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not very natural to us.
And that's an old Celtic tradition. So it was actually in some things that I've read have been said that even the father's a man's relationship to his nephew is almost stronger than to their own son. That connection in Celtic lore and Celtic culture way back when was very, very strong, and this idea of foster children helped to build the families together. So ideally, if Arthur had children earlier, he could have even sent some of his children to be fostered by one of his sister or her sister's family, and that's why in the oldest stories, Gawain is Arthur's most prized knight. Like, bar none, he can do anything. He's the rock star. And then slowly other people come in, and in different tales he kind of changes, his whole personality changes. By the time you get to Mallory, he's an absolute jerk. He's awful. He sides with the wrong people. He's conniving. But over time that changed. So I wanted to blend those a little bit. But it is interesting. And it's not uncommon for that to happen. But they still have big family complexes, right? Like when Anna's done with her time in Orkney, she's got to come home, and they try to keep everybody as close as possible. But yeah, the nephew uncle relationship is historically very, very strong, and I wanted to maintain that in the story. And it's different for boys, always is. Women in especially in Western culture, in higher ranking families, were seen as very disposable. They had the dowry. They were going to be married off for an alliance. It's essentially arranged marriages, right? It's not a concept that's just known in some areas, and would be, and in some places it was almost like, this is a loner child, so we're not going to spend the time to get to know them and to invest in their education. This person is really a pawn, and that's kind of where you get most of the women in the story had no say at any point. With the exception of Morgan and Morgause, and even to an extent on them as well, that they're only able to get away with it because they're Arthur's half sisters.
And even Morgan was.
So you're telling me that the Celtic tradition, they were avuncular in nature? Interesting.
They were, yeah. Well, kind of. It was just considered a very important connection, and very often nephews would be raised by their uncles. Yep.
Avuncular, yes.
Yeah.
And that's
but not right? Not always, but yeah. That's where the tradition came from with Gawain and Arthur.
Yeah, even Morgan and Margos, they had some privileges, but in the end, they were women. They had to do things accordingly. Or even if you speak of Vivian, I think I'm giving too many spoilers now in the non-spoiler section. Okay, so
are we officially in the spoilers section? That's okay. We can make the.
Well, okay. I could give a disclaimer right now that I'm going to delve into a lot of spoilers. So in case you want to save yourself, maybe now is a good time to stop listening. Go ahead, read the book, and then come back and complete this video. We'll wait for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, going to the spoiler section, like I was saying, Vivian was a marvelous witch, but constrained only because, Merlin didn't like her or didn't like her prophecies.
Right.
It's just sad. She was, of course, more powerful than him because, it was obvious that one only somehow imprisons somebody else when they're afraid of them being far more powerful, So, yeah, that was rather sad. But talking about Merlin, I found it interesting that throughout the book, it seemed to me that Merlin was the focus. He was the main villain, so to say. But then in the end, Anna realizes that she actually had a lot of grievances, maybe against her brother too, because he was the one really controlling her reigns, he was, Merlin was just directing him, but he was the one actually carrying out the orders. And so, what do you think about this?
Okay.
Well, go ahead, Sanchi.
Yeah, so basically another point that I would like to add in the same question is that somehow Merlin seems like, this omnipresent shadow, that he's everywhere in the world, to the point that he obscures everything that should be important, right? Which kind of ties in with her whole being able to pull the shadows, even though the biggest shadow here is Merlin. So I found this entire concept really mind-blowing and poetic.
Well, and that's kind of the idea is, in a way, shadows was something I played a lot with, right? And this idea that he gives her this he interprets this prophecy, and he's literally forgetting her. He doesn't realize that he's probably missing something very important, because he, like many men of his age, overlook women, especially once you've had a couple of babies and you're a widow. You're not terribly important. You're not going to be. Are you going to go off to war? You're not magical, or you're not magical enough. I actually love Merlin. I have no beef against Merlin whatsoever, but I wanted a sort of. Usually Merlin is sort of painted in either sort of a crazy way or kind of endearingly mad and powerful, and I thought it would be better, and that's one of the reasons that I think the scene is so important, that when Nimue really sees him for what he is, which is an old man, the humanity of that kind of is very sad. And I think that I don't know how much you know of the whole story, but Arthur's stuff is not going to go well. Like the end of Arthur's story and Lance's story, and you kind of see at the end, I have sort of seeds of that happening. Things are not going to go well for them. And it takes Anna to see that, to really realize as well, I mean, who knows who's really pulling the strings of everything, I mean, even she's able to get to the book and back to Vivian, I wanted the Lady of the Lake. It's always this ethereal, wispy woman who lives in a lake and has a sword. And I was like, what if she's just a blacksmith and she's really magical and she's kind of a badass lesbian who lives out in the middle of a lake and actually has kind of made her life awesome. She's got a garden and she's got a beautiful view. She got to raise Lancelot for 15 years or so. She loves him like a son. She stuck to her guns. She would not relent to keep herself make herself acceptable to Merlin, and that's the important part about her. And so she sticks to her swords, I guess you would say, and Merlin is powerful.
Unintended.
Yeah, Merlin is powerful, and he does. I think his biggest fault is that he doesn't. He's such a big picture person that he loses really the understanding of how and when. I mean, Anna really starts to realize, because I think she becomes a better character when at first it's about her. It's very personal. It's, you ruined my life. You made everything terrible. And then she slowly realizes how all the women that come in and out of Caroline have had things fall apart because of Merlin's insistence on having Arthur and building up Camelot and making everything, what it is. They have all been the unfortunate victims. And so she's like, well, he can't see me, essentially. What can I do? And it will take time. And it does take time. And that was intentional. That it's not overnight. She has to work really hard for a very long time while things are still happening. But she's in it for the long game. And so many of these stories are so cause and effect. It's very much like, oh, this adventure and then this adventure and then this thing happens. But for her, it's building it up brick by brick over time, making sure that it's firm, because she is going to go all in at the risk of potentially everything.
Yeah, and I actually, now that I look at it, it makes sense that things happen the way they happen, because I don't think Nimue would be able to live with herself if she, say, stabbed Merlin in the heart, and then she wouldn't be able to live anyway. Anna would have to probably live with that soul crushed throughout her life.
Yeah, and I think that's, in some ways, I think Nimue is kind of that. It in some ways takes from an older Jewish tradition, and my dad's side of the family is Jewish. The golem, this idea of this creature created from clay. If you've read The Golem and the Genie, it's one of my favorite books of all time. Beautiful, beautiful book. And in a lot of ways, Nimue is almost an emotional golem. She is just this creature of, like you said earlier, of want and need and desire. But she has no history. She has no future. She is certainly this part of Anna, like this daughter she never had, that is also connected to her. So in that way, she is kind of disposable, which is sad, but it is this. That's how the story goes. They get locked in the tree together, and that's we don't really know what happens after, and that's kind of how I wanted to adapt that particular piece. So I did a lot of twisting things around, because that's how my brain works.
No, it was beautiful.
You said that Nimue was like the daughter she never had, but isn't she also like the mask that Anna wore?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's that whole thing, right? I think it was an Oscar Wilde quote that give a man a mask and he will show you who he really is. Mm-hmm. So
yes.
How applicable is that in this situation?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That the whole if you go the first scene when Anna first sees Huifar for the first time, who's this sultry woman who barely wears any clothes, has sex with everybody, lives in this basically like Circusville in the middle of the castle, doesn't give a shit, about anybody around her or what they think. She's actually jealous of her. She's very jealous of her because she's somehow, because her sisters all got scooped up and her dad doesn't ever tell her no, and she's attracted to her and she doesn't really know what to do. She keeps staring at her and she's this, red-haired goddess who's like 6 feet tall. And that's who Nimue ends up falling in love with and truly falling in love with. And Huifar disappears and that breaks Nimue. She's not deep enough to understand that life is back and forth. She gave her whole heart to her and she's gone and there's no resolve. And I think so many of us have probably, whether it's through death or just people being jerks, sometimes people leave. And if you don't have the emotional connection to beyond that, it's so baffling. And that was kind of, as she was breaking down, it was important that she had kind of her own little journey too. But yeah, she does all the things. I mean, Anna doesn't eat much food. She looks at food a lot, but she's probably got an eating disorder. She is very, she's very controlling about her clothing and fitting into her clothing and making sure it fits right. And meanwhile, Nimue is like, no shoes and complaining about her corsets and getting naked whenever she can. So yeah, I think there's definitely all the things that she would want to do, including, getting that close to, because Anna could never be that close to Merlin. There's no way. Nothing would have worked. So it had to be completely somebody else.
That was a really interesting twist that I thought that came in the book. And also that leads me to my next question, which is basically, how did you build your magical system in this world? Because, there are like prophecies and then some people can do magic. So how does that work out here?
Yeah, I wanted a lower magic, essentially, where it is. It's so the idea is that there are prophets and then there's prophet interpreters. So it's not always just very clear, because I think that prophecies can be, I don't love prophecy in story. I think that can be kind of a little bit cheesy. So I wanted it to be that it could be potentially open-ended. And one of the reasons that Vivian and Merlin conflict is because they have different understandings of certain prophecies, and she's always making life difficult for him. He wants to hear what he wants to hear. Sound familiar? I don't know if you know any people that are like that. And then the magic is more, I mean, in some ways, kind of herbal magic, simple magic. It's not a lot of glitz and glamour and explosions and changing people with polyjuice potions, sort of a la Harry Potter. It's much more the simple practice, discipline of magic, or making magical weapons, or, but even in the woods narrative, we hear about one kind of animal that's sort of a magical animal, but there's not a whole lot of it. I think part of it is that there's probably more, but Anna lives a very sheltered life and doesn't get out of the castle very often. But also I think it's a world where humanity is kind of overtaking, and she's very conscious of that. I wrote a lot of that it's a little bit of an environmentalism message, but when she's coming back to Carillon for the first time in 20 years, she doesn't recognize it. The wild lands of her youth are gone. So she feels like a stranger in her own land. And I think a lot of the magic has been kind of lost as well. So I call it a lower magic. And it's mostly through books and rituals and spells. But there's a big cost to it. I wanted that to be really clear too. Like, Anna does all of this stuff, but it takes her a long time. And she loses a lot. And she has to go through a lot of suffering on top of everything else going on in her life to achieve her aims. So I don't like when magic doesn't cost anything. And actually, that's one of the points that is made in T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which is one of my favorite books of all time. But Merlin basically explains to Wart, he's like, which is young Arthur, you can't make a loaf of bread out of nowhere. It comes from somewhere. As a magician, you are summoning it from someone. So someone's going to lose that bread. You can't, basically this nod to sort of, energy cannot be made or destroyed. Matter cannot be made or destroyed. And magic has to hold that. But I kind of want it to be a little bit airy and ethereal too, because you don't want to make it too defined. I don't enjoy magic systems that are overly defined, because then I get stuck trying to figure out exactly what it is. So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, Natania, the meeting will end soon. So can we come back again?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. Guys, this is it. If you want to hear the rest of the interview, please log on to We'll put the links in the description, and